for joining us for our final session of the day. I have the really great pleasure of having Deborah Winchell of BlackRock join me today, who I haven't met previously, although have read about her and met several other people on her team. We're going to have a formal but informal conversation. It's just the two of us, and she might ask me some questions, and I might answer them, depending if I like them. And I just want to welcome her, and in case there's anybody here who doesn't know who BlackRock is, BlackRock is the world's largest money manager with, at least the last data I saw, $4.5 trillion under assets.
4.7
4.7. This was only like last week, okay? So 4.7. And one of the great things I think about being the last speaker is that I have or being the last panelist is that I have an opportunity to bring in some of the themes of the plenary sessions we've already had and some of the breakouts we've already had and some of those conversations. So, it gives us other pieces of information for our conversation. So first, I just want to start with setting some context for you. So you're relatively new to BlackRock. You moved to BlackRock from the Robinhood Foundation. And so what personal and professional experiences contributed to your desire to take the helm of BlackRock's new impact unit?
Well, first, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good?
Can you hear her?
First, thanks for having me. It's fun to be here. I think it's good to be the last speaker. I'm glad to hear there are drinks afterwards. That's like always a good context to be talking within. So we were just talking about careers, and I guess you had a panel and talked about career paths. I never could have predicted that I would be at BlackRock doing this job, even a year ago. I think it just speaks to so often how your experiences and your skills and your interests converge over time. And I started in financial institutions. I started at JP Morgan. My husband reminded me that I said I would never go back to a large financial institution. Here I sit. And it was an investment banker for a long time, mostly because I just kept doing more interesting things, never with the intention of doing that. I had a background in political science and international affairs, and I always thought I would do something in the nonprofit world, but I didn't know how to get there, and I just assumed that being in finance would be great experience for eventually crossing over, and I did eventually have the opportunity to move over to the Met, where I was the chief financial officer and then later took over most of the operations. And I raised the Met because it was the first time that I got to really think about this double bottom line. I was in charge of finance and strategy, but within the context of a deeply mission-driven organization. And to start that conversation about if you don't have a strong financial underpinning and those aren't objectives, you really can't support the mission. It was also with Central Park as our landlord and our backyard, learning how I ran construction, and you couldn't move a leaf without getting permission. And so again, really learning about how to bring all those elements together in running an operation. I then moved over to Robinhood, and I would say one of the most valuable lessons that I learned, or sort of the perspective that I gained there, was all around metrics. And for those of you who don't know Robinhood, it's the largest poverty-fighting organization in New York City. It raises about $150 million a year and spends about $150 million a year. And the most interesting part about it, other than its very large parties, is that it came up with a way of measuring one poverty intervention against another. So you could compare a soup kitchen and to an early childhood program. And so that lens of metrics that I really learned there, I think was absolutely instrumental in helping me figure out what could I bring to BlackRock to help BlackRock create a platform at scale that would allow investors to not only incorporate but understand how their investments could create another impact or outcome in addition to the finance. That's a really long-winded answer, but
no, but yeah, and so I guess one of the questions about going to BlackRock and the impact unit is that while BlackRock has been a signatory to the PRI and has reported to our trends report, for example, for a long time, it's been a relatively quiet player up until now in the sustainable and impact space. And did that play a role, the idea of being able to sort of roll out something a little bit more multifaceted and really more public for BlackRock?
Right. The opportunity to work with a firm of such large scale that could really move the needle for a boss who was already out there talking about sort of long-term sustainable value. He was Larry Fink, who I think really is a visionary in this space, was the one who recruited me to BlackRock from Robinhood. And this opportunity, first of all, I found out that BlackRock wasn't new to the space. They already had $200 billion or so under management within that broad pillar of sustainability, but that they were so committed to the idea of bringing all those pockets together, creating a platform primarily in response to what clients were interested in and asking for, but also really in line with the vision that Larry had.
Right. So you talked a little bit about some of the client demand, but from your understanding when you interviewed, what was the impetus for them to form this kind of new BlackRock Impact Unit, and how does it differ from ESG and impact initiatives that were already happening?
At BlackRock?
Yes, at BlackRock. Yeah.
Well, I think there were two drivers. One was just the conversations that we were having with clients. We had a lot of clients in Europe who were very sophisticated already in this space, and that we were doing a lot of work with, but it wasn't really integrated throughout the firm, either in terms of clients or in terms of products. And there was a group of my colleagues, of millennials, I guess you don't need to characterize that, who had been really fascinated with this field of impact investing. And so aside from their day job, they got together and they were doing lots of research, a lot of digging around what was BlackRock doing, what were others doing, and they got a sponsor from our executive committee and made a presentation saying, we really think BlackRock should be involved and leading this space in a much more formal way. And they got approval to do that. The firm decided to create a platform, hire somebody to run it. So it was really an interesting sort of external momentum and internal, I would say, impetus that got me here today.
Well, and what's interesting is one of the conversations we had yesterday, we had a town hall on the future of sustainable and impact investing, kind of where we would be in 5 years, is a conversation about sort of being at a pivotal moment, right? We all hear a lot about the field. We are all experiencing growth in the field. In our trends report, we certainly experience growth every 2 years in assets. And yet, when we did our report on ESG integration, we found out that 16 of the 16 money managers we looked at, half of them really aren't doing ESG integration in a holistic or transparent way. When we talk to firms that say they're doing sustainable or impact investing, sometimes they are, and sometimes they're sort of at an incredibly entry-level space. So I think we all feel responsible, I know US SIF does, to make sure that the field grows, but also that the field has some depth and some rigor. And as a big, big institution, what do you see as the challenges in your own institution and others to really creating a kind of rigorous, multifaceted approach to sustainable and impact investing?
Well, first I would say I think of the challenges we face, everyone faces. I think we're all trying to figure this out together in the smartest way possible. From my point of view, the single biggest challenge is data. Data. I say it every day, that it's hard to have rigor and great metrics and transparency and reporting, all the things that we think as a firm of our scale we can bring to this sector through everything we do. The struggle is always wrapping that around data that at times we think is not always the most rigorous. And so I would say for all of us, disclosure, data, quality of data, standardization, things that we can all look to and measure together. We find that there's some instances where creating our own data and our own benchmarks is helpful, but I would say for the most part, we think that anytime there's a third-party set of data, third-party benchmarks, green bond principles, anything like that we can support, it's better for the industry, it's better for everyone, and certainly better for investors.
So it's interesting, when we talk about sustainable and impact investing, we talk about it across all asset classes. We've really tried to move the conversation of impact from what I call small I, private equity, to large I, all the asset classes, right? When I was at a meeting at BlackRock several months ago for a broader coalition initiative, someone from BlackRock did a presentation which looked very much like the world US SIF talks about, which is how do you take impact and sustainable investment and put it across all asset classes? So I'd love to know right now where BlackRock sits in its ability to do that, and what products it has now, and where it hopes to go over the next several years in the ESG and impact space.
Well, first I would say that yes, yes, and yes, and add scale, right? So for us, it's how do you take sustainability across all asset classes, but do it in a scalable way. And so as soon as you introduce the concept of scale, it challenges some of the fundamental definitions. It has to. So for us, it's about how can we find that intersection of impact and sustainability and scalable opportunities for our clients. Because for our clients, if it's not scalable, it's not delivering what they need. So when we first sketched out the platform, we looked at where all of our products and assets were, and we created a framework that I think for some feels not as focused or concentrated, but because, again, it's in response to what our clients are looking to do. It ranges from screens, just negative screening, to products that are really characterized by ESG, and then what we would call more traditionally impact. And the goal that we have is to really build out products across the entire asset class spectrum. And the way that we constructed our platform within BlackRock, rather than creating an impact investing unit that would have its own products and its own client people, et cetera, the first thing that was so evident after I did my 3 months of onboarding and met hundreds of people was that there was this incredible network. And the way that we would be most powerful and effective is to just partner globally with every single product area, every single asset class, every client group, to create this virtual team. So when we're building out products in one asset class, it's not with an impact, it's in partnership with whatever that asset class is. We also thought that we should start where there were the biggest gaps. So we started really with the public equity space, because we felt that there wasn't a lot that was scalable, liquid, public. I'm moving very actively into fixed income, which we're finding is getting tremendous take-up from investors very quickly. Renewables, global renewable power. We already had that fund. We wrapped impact metrics around it. We did nothing to change the product. We just said, you should be reporting out in a very transparent way what your product does, and did the same with infrastructure debt. We had a client who said, we would love to have better reporting. We don't know yet if we want this to be an impact mandate. Let's pilot this together and wrap metrics around it. Green bonds, another place where we had a lot of experience and a lot of history that we were going to continue to build out. And now that we're starting to get more established in those sectors, we're starting to move more into some of the private spaces where we, where we think there's, there are a lot of great players already in, in a lot of the private equity, a lot of the private spaces that we had a lot of respect for and thought, let's focus where there isn't as much, and then we'll start moving over and see what can we bring that doesn't already exist.
Well, you had said early on that in this answer that you started with the public equities because you didn't see a lot of options there, whereas I think one of the criticisms against the sustainable space for several years had been we do too much in public equities and not enough in some of the other classes, and we've had a lot of history in the public equity markets. So was it that you didn't feel there were broad enough options for your clients, or what was the feeling around that? Because the public equity markets have been fairly, I would say, robust and vigorous in their approach to ESG in the 10 years ago vis-a-vis other asset classes. That's changed in the last decade.
Yeah, we found that clients were still looking for things that had better metrics around them, that were a little bit more, again, more liquid. We thought that there was a lot in public equities, but maybe not in a liquid, tradable form. I hear what you're saying. I mean, I know that when you look across the whole asset class, for example, fixed income was really, there was more of a need. But we also felt that some of the early work we were doing was more suitable for equities, and then we figured out we're just about to launch something that's based on a public equity product that we had, but took a lot more construction to figure out how to translate that into fixed income. We also felt that the fixed income market was developing. A year ago when I started, there were a lot of questions about fixed income. A year later, we're finding there's much more demand for fixed income. And we find that that's true across the board, and it varies by region. But the client demand, the difference between having great interest and wanting to commit assets is not necessarily the same, right? And then trying to figure out how to translate that and to put that priority around our clients as we figure out what to launch first is what we spend a lot of time doing right now.
And a big question is, so when you began, there is $200 billion in the BlackRock Impact portfolio. Has that changed? Has it grown?
It is growing. I mean, the lion's share of what we had was in screens. You know, that was a legacy business. That's where a lot of our clients had comfort, and that's a huge base. So to grow off of that base, you know, when we look at each one of our individual products, there's great growth, but you put it on the base of all those screens, it's going to take time for that number to grow. But I would say, you know, we have as we do with everything, we have a very long-term perspective on this business. We know that while we may have clients in Europe who have been doing this for years, we're finding there are a lot of clients in the US who, you know, they'll say, we want to come and talk to you about impact. Great. You walk into the room, they look at you look at them, and you realize that they just want to know what is impact, what is sustainability. You know, we have certainly a lot of clients. We see family offices, very sophisticated. You know, they've been doing this for years. But we see a lot of clients who are just saying, we know that this is something that we should be considering. How can we put our toe in the water? What can we do that really replicates a core investment, but lets us start to talk about that added dimension in our investment portfolio? So we see the spectrum, and I think the last thing that we are looking to do is just to grow assets, because the one thing I say at BlackRock, and I say to my team all the time, is the only, I think, well, maybe not the only, but one of the most significant concerns I have, or risks that I think we all face, is overpromising and not being clear with clients what the product does and what it doesn't do. So if it's going to take time for clients to figure out how they want to express their investment objectives through strategies, then they should take time and figure that out. And that this, from our point of view, is about, a lot of it's about education right now. A lot of it is working hand in hand with clients to figure out what would look what would look like what they're trying to accomplish, and that takes time, because it's, you know, I think that there's such value in creating scale and not having lots and lots of customized products, but that takes time.
And when you talk to your clients, because as I said, this word impact is sort of so both underused and overused, and whenever I go into a room, I say, this is what I mean by impact investing, so if you and I were going to have a conversation, I could actually be sure we were having the same one. So when you talk to your clients who are largely in the public equities market, whether it's screen funds or ESG integration, whatever you're doing, how do you talk to them about impact in the public equities market?
So obviously one of the most interesting conversations we have, particularly with our most sophisticated clients. And so, you know, the screen conversation is very straightforward. The ESG conversation is not so straightforward. First of all, it often includes a screen. So right away, by trying to completely segregate the markets, you can't. There's a lot of bundling we see. And even talking about best in class, thematics, we find that we spend a lot of time just focused on that ESG space. I really thought a year ago that we would be moving very quickly beyond that, but I think that ESG, those three letters, have taken hold in a way that I certainly couldn't have predicted. I think that, you know, a lot of it is what's happened around climate with COP21 and the whole change in perspective in our country about how critical an issue climate impact is. But we find that a lot of times we don't even get off of that conversation. For us, we think there's an opportunity to introduce products that have very well-defined outcomes at the outset, and that being able to share that lens of what the product or the strategy is trying to accomplish, and then being able to measure and report on that brings an impact perspective to it. For us to do that in the public market, so we do our global renewable power product. To us, that's an impact product. You know, you're creating that. It's very clear what the outcomes are. To do it in the public space means that those outcomes probably would have happened whether you invested or not. So, you know, you could argue that's ESG on steroids. Sometimes I call it passive impact. But the point is, you know, like we introduced a product last year that's very clear about the health outcomes, the green patent outcomes. You know, this is what we're looking for compared to the benchmark, and this is what we're measuring. This has an impact quality to it. That's in the impact bucket for us. But, you know, we could spend all day debating whether or not it's impact. I think for us, there's a chance to bring that conversation and those very specific outcomes to mainstream investors. And whether or not it really completely reflects what we would consider, I mean, you know, my colleague John McKinley, who comes from Acumen, he's sort of our litmus test all the time. And it's, you know, we don't think you can replicate that necessarily in the public markets. But I think, again, as long as we're clear about what it is delivering and why it's different than ESG, I think it adds value to what investors have as options, particularly investors who don't have access often to the more sophisticated,
the accredited market.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really interesting thing, a piece for a big firm to think about, because I know that when we're having the impact conversation, the small I impact conversation around private equity, it's largely geared towards super high net worth or high net worth folks. And so the question is, you know, as almost all the firms in this room at some level are serving retail investors, how do you make that happen?
Right.
And one of the things Seth Magaziner said yesterday, the treasurer of Rhode Island, was give me an SRI ESG life cycle fund for retirement. Yeah. Right? And so how do we do that? I think when someone asks me what needs to happen in 5 years, we need more innovative products in the retail market. And is BlackRock thinking about that?
We work very closely with our retail partners. You know, we don't have direct retail distribution. What we're trying to do is create portfolios and products that resonate primarily to the platforms, you know, whether it's a Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley or some of the direct platforms or even some of the robo-advisors. Every time a robo-advisor comes online, I always have to sign up and, you know, see what it's all about. And inevitably, it has our products, you know, whether it's a CRBN or an iClean, already on their portfolio. So, you know, again, I think there's an opportunity for us to help figure out how to create really portfolios for their clients that can just be plug and play. But, you know, a lot of these retail platforms, you know, they need a track record, there's a time frame, there's a long lead time of investment that we're working with them on. And again, because we're not directly a retail house, we often need to go work with those partners to try to gauge where the retail interest is, to make sure that we're creating products that really meet their needs. And, you know, that takes time. But we work very closely with all of those partners, both in the US and very much in Europe, where we find the retail investors definitely becoming increasingly interested in this kind of product.
Well, we had a session, which I didn't get to see, on robo-advisors and SRI, and then we are seeing every day there's some new firm contacting us, even if it's in a conceptual form, that wants to provide SRI options online. And so this seems to be something that in 5 years we're really going to see just a tremendous change in the way people are investing.
We think so too, and one of the things I find so interesting about the robo-advisors is everyone always says, oh, it's the millennials, and, you know, but it's not just the millennials. We find that a lot of the robo-advisors attract retail investors across the sort of generation spectrum, and even across that spectrum, there's a lot of interest in ESG impact, you know, screened investments, which I think is just incredibly encouraging. You know, you always read that so much of this demographic change is attributed to millennials, which of course it is, but I don't think they alone are driving this interest. We see it really across the board.
And where does BlackRock think the interest is going to be coming for ESG and SRI products over the next 10 years? What sectors do you think is going to be driving demand?
I think it's what sectors aren't going to be driving demand. Every day people say, is this a fad? Is this, you know, and there's so many different factors. I think that the focus on climate how can that change, right? I think that that's become not only, it's moved beyond however you would classify it as a political or a social issue or anything that might sort of have waves to a clear economic issue that's not going to change. I hope. I don't think so. I think that's one factor. I think we see regulatory changes globally that focus on not just climate regulation, but on ESG disclosure. I think that's a very promising change. I think that the drive that we see with consumers around company behavior, responsible behavior, supply chain issues, all of that is just translating into investments, I think. And so to me, that's another bellwether of this, I think, is a movement that when we talk about ESG, and again, we get to see the regional differences because we are everywhere regionally. And we talk about ESG with some of our European investors, and I mean BlackRock investors. And that's just a part of their investment process, right? They don't think about ESG as 3 unique letters, and that's an added dimension. Those are factors that very much drive shareholder value and economic return. And so I think that over time, I hope, but I really believe this is likely to be the case, that there will just be an increasing adoption both on the investment side and on the expectation that investors should have, that these are considerations that are absolutely critical to thinking about what makes for smart investments, no matter what lens you're coming at it from.
Right. Well, most of the folks in this room would probably agree that shareholder engagement plays a role in sustainable investment. And while I know that you are not responsible for that in the work that you're doing at BlackRock, given that this is inclusion as a strategy for so many, do you coordinate activities in any way with folks like Michelle Edkins and others who are doing the governance and other shareholder engagement work?
So I know Michelle was here a few years ago, and for those who weren't here, she runs our investment stewardship, and she's really responsible for protecting shareholder value for our investors with every firm in which we invest, which is most. And she and I, she's got to be one of my best friends at BlackRock because, for in so many ways. First of all, she is our subject matter expert on ESG, on all things ESG. She's been talking about governance and social issues and environmental issues with every company. We engage with over 1,500 companies a year, and those are the conversations that she's having daily. So, right away when I was interviewing with BlackRock, it was an incredible asset in my mind that we already had this very deep expertise thinking about these issues in the firm. And so while she doesn't get as involved in the commercial aspect, which I do in terms of creating strategies, she's our sounding board, she's our partner in virtually everything that we do. Okay. So, they have over 20 colleagues around the world talking about ESG and talking to our clients about ESG, sort of both sides of it. And so absolutely fundamental to what we do.
So we've had some interesting conversations here the last 2 days about diversity. We had a session on sort of expanding diversity internationally with several different international companies yesterday. This morning, Teresa Whitmarsh, who I think is still in the room, the executive director of the Washington State Investment Board, who's spoken widely, including here, about the lack of women in private equity and its implications. What is BlackRock's strategy and commitment to diversity, both in communities of color and in women, and making sure they're in senior positions? What's the strategy internally?
Well, here I am.
Well, yes.
I think that was I was encouraged,
Okay.
But no, I mean, I think that BlackRock understands as a shareholder that diversity is smart business. Just for all the studies that you read, I mean, you don't have to read a lot of studies to know it, but it's empirically true. So I think that it's a tough industry, as we know. I've spent a lot of time in this industry, so I do know that private equity, whatever, venture capital, it's crazy, right? How the lack of diversity. But I think it's a very serious commitment on the part of our leadership. I certainly was something I gave a lot of thought to before joining a firm to make sure that that was the lens and that was the leadership's commitment. So we think it's extremely important across the board in sort of every sense of diversity. And, as you know, that can mean so many things, right? In terms of what you just mentioned, but also the perspective that people bring to any conversation. So absolutely. And then secondly, one of the things that we're exploring is how can we provide diversity in investment strategies. And we talked briefly about the group out in San Francisco called Scientific Active Equity, which does a lot of our big data, quant analysis. They scrape social media and all the other sources they can so we can try to create, in addition to all the ESG data, our own scoring model. Because again, just going back to the very first comment I made about the lack of quality data, non-self-reported data. And they've done a lot of work around diversity, coming up with 5, 6, 7 signals that we think correlate with performance. And this is a good example of talking about products in your pipeline. So now we think we have a really interesting diversity product. How do we now see where the demand is, and is there enough demand to create a scalable product? Or does it need to be in partnership with other dimensions of, climate or health or whatever. So that's what I mean by this iterative role that we play between sort of the research, the product development, and then seeing where the client demand is.
Okay. And so when you look back at I think it's a year and a half at BlackRock?
Almost.
Almost. What's been most surprising?
What's been most surprising? I am surprised by the accelerated pace of this sector. I didn't expect it to grow as quickly as it had. I mean, obviously, by joining BlackRock, I was very excited at the prospect of this becoming a much more mainstream, significant sector and investment. But I think, and again, I attribute some of it to what happened in the climate space, but I did not anticipate the level of interest and conversation and sophistication developing around ESG and impact and all of the conversations, and I certainly didn't expect it around climate.
Yeah, we had Sheldon Whitehouse here this morning talking about, just a very frank conversation about what we all need to be doing politically in a way if we're going to move the ball forward on climate. And so I guess when you say you're surprised at how accelerated it is, does that make you almost feel like BlackRock's behind the 8 ball even as it started in terms of so much interest and demand, and a year and a half in? So do you feel like you have to be running faster than you anticipated to keep up?
I don't know. I'm always running fast, it seems. But I don't feel like we're behind the 8 ball, but I feel that there's a tremendous pressure and responsibility to figure this out in a smart way as fast as we can, and to do it in a rigorous way. And I get back to this data issue. I mean, what keeps me up at night is how do we build smart products for clients?
Right. Right. Well, I think we're at the time to open up for questions. So we have 2 different microphones here, so if people want to get in line if they've got questions.
Afternoon, and thank you for a very, very interesting discussion. Really appreciate hearing the insights you have from BlackRock. For those of us who are looking at trends...
Tim, will you just introduce yourself?
Say again? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
Yourself.
Tim
Thank
Smith
you.
from Walden Asset Management. For those of us who are looking for trends and tipping points, the kind of input you're giving us, I think very much helps validate this field. You're hearing from your clients, and we're hearing from our clients that there's more of a need and a demand. And as Lisa's questions indicate, there's obviously trying to figure out what certain types of clients want and need. But thank you for that, and thank you for joining PRI as well, and you're putting your weight there. This is a comment, perhaps not so much for your unit as the unit Michelle has, but one of the things we would evaluate a company's performance on as an investment manager is her proxy voting. And as you know, BlackRock votes against every single social and environmental issue. So if ESG issues matter, and matter to the bottom line, it's sort of inconceivable to me how every single resolution that's being voted on today at ExxonMobil and Chevron, which, by the way, at Chevron got 41% of the vote on a climate resolution, why BlackRock says, I'm not playing in that space. So again, feel free to say, well, that's not my bailiwick, but I'd love to hear your comments if you have any.
Well, it's not my bailiwick.
Okay, fair enough. You can take the message.
But I'll just say, when you say doesn't play in that space, I would say it's probably one of the most active firms in that space. I think the fact that we have over 20 people whose job is only to engage around governance, social and environmental. I think that BlackRock has a responsibility as such an incredibly large shareholder to be as engaged as it can in a way that's kind of unique to any of the large asset managers. And, you know, we feel very strongly that engagement, talking about these issues with management and the board is absolutely fundamentally one of the most valuable things that we can bring to shareholders. So I just want to underscore that I think by just virtue of the profile that Michelle has in the field, that this is something that BlackRock takes with extreme seriousness and is of very high importance and value to us.
And
so,
I do take your point. Your conversations with companies do move managements and move needles, and we want to give credit to that.
I think
and you do vote very actively and have for years on governance. And why do you vote for governance issues? Because you know that some of those issues affect shareholder value and protect shareholder interests. And I think what we're trying to say is that we'll just take climate as an example. Climate change issues also affect shareholder value, and that's why we're talking about ESG integration, and investors with trillions of dollars annually or in assets under management are debating these issues. So for me, it feels like a logical disconnect. You vote for governance because it affects shareholder value, but I know you're not absent. You talk to the companies, but then you vote against shareholder interests. That's unacceptable as a leader, which I know you aspire to be, in responsible investing.
Thanks, Tim.
Paul Hilton with Trillium Asset Management, Chair of the Board of US SIF. We're undertaking right now a new strategic plan at the board level for US SIF, thinking about how we can reach out to more and more members and build on the growing momentum in the field. As you think about how an industry association could be useful to your organization, what would you like to see to help you do things that you can't do on your own?
Well, that's a great question. You know, we value so much the players who precede us and who have an active voice in this space. We think the reports, the white papers, the attempts to, and I say attempts because it's so hard to quantify the growth in this space, how to segment the space, what investors are thinking, what asset managers are doing. You know, we appreciate it all. I think that it's just to have independent third-party organizations who are giving a lot of thought and leadership is absolutely fundamental. And I would just say, please keep doing what you're doing.
Okay, we'll go over there.
Hi, this is Rosanna Landis-Weaver. I'm with As You Sow, and I'm following up on Tim, still not your bailiwick, but you know, he mentioned that you vote on governance, but you don't vote particularly on the advisory vote on compensation, which, you know, under Dodd-Frank, it's part of your fiduciary responsibility. 99+% of the time, it's in favor of management, and that's completely at variance with not just the people here, but with public pension funds and with State Street, and you guys are just such the outlier on that. And there was a shareholder proposal on that today that I know was supported by CalPERS and State of Rhode Island up at the annual meeting in New York this morning. And I understand the importance of engagement, but the engagement is behind closed doors, and voting is a public signal and allows investors, and that's what people in this room do, is believe in transparency. It's almost like you're saying we're so big we can lobby, we don't have to vote, or, you know, we're going to buy our way in. I don't know. I mean, that's really maybe putting words. I know that's putting words in your mouth that you are not saying. But there's a very anti-democratic thing about we're not going to vote, and we don't need to vote because we engage. And that's, you know, I just wanted to bring forth that perspective.
Okay.
Great.
Did you want to respond in any way? Do you want to respond?
No, let's go ahead. Go ahead. I don't know that I can add much. I just underscore the value of engagement on all the issues you raised, by the way.
But it definitely does sound like there's a conversation that several people would love to have at some point with BlackRock about these issues. And I know some people are having that. And maybe one of the things that could go back with you is a message from this community that there is an interest in a broader conversation about voting?
Well, two things I
Yeah.
would say. I just briefly say that you should go on the website. We try to be as public as we absolutely can be once voting season has taken place on all of our voting. And secondly, I think Michelle should come back next year. It sounds like it'd be a great conversation.
I think we'll bring Larry back next year, right, and have the conversation with him. Okay, go on.
Great. Truman Siemens from Intersect.
Can you say that again?
Yes, Truman Siemens from Intersect.
Okay.
A couple of questions. One is, when you think about factors that are material but that aren't well covered out in the products and the themes, particularly within an environment where there's not a lot of options out there for retail or institutional investors. What are some of the ones, you mentioned a couple that you all have developed. What are some of the ones that you think are most interesting and we might look for in the products that you all bring forward? And the second question is around the barrier that comes up in a lot of conversations here of track record in this space. So the difference, a lot of interest, but a lot of the commitment waiting for track record behind the managers and waiting for that to come. So, what are your thoughts there, and how will your BlackRock's strategies in this space affect the availability of long track record product?
Well, first, I think you're asking about themes around products. A couple things I would say. First of all, I think by creating products that have more aspects or dimensions to them, even within a theme, is going to be a very valuable aspect that we can really bring to product development. So, for example, when we're talking about climate, right now, we talk mostly about reserves or scope 1, scope 2. Can we create products that focus on supply chain, water scarcity, right? There's so many other aspects that, again, we think are just limited primarily by data. That's an area we're spending a lot of time. So taking a theme and trying to figure out how to make it more rigorous in terms of what it's contributing or what it's measuring and why it's meaningful in that particular thematic. I mentioned the same along diversity. 5 or 6 or 7 different ways to measure it, I think, give all of these products more dimension and I think, better performance in the outcomes that we're seeking. So that would be one thing. We're really interested in private companies because, again, there's one of the complications that we find when we're using any sort of scoring model around public companies is for us, if you're doing something that's based on an index, they're big, they're complex, they might have great outcomes on one hand. Inevitably, they're going to have, whether it's controversy or other issues that are going to have maybe not such great outcomes. And so part of the product development is, what are the pros, what are the cons? How do you measure them? How do you weigh them so that net it's a positive outcome? That's been a really interesting process. But I think there's some opportunities around private companies that tend to have a more pure or mono product line or area of focus that would make it a little easier to measure some of the outcomes that we're talking about. So that's another area that we're interested in. Real assets, getting better around measurement. So, for example, infrastructure, I think that's such an interesting area in so many ways when you think about the potential outcomes, whether it's economic, social, financial, environmental. How can we get better measurement and reporting around that? So those are kind of the things, reporting, measurement, data, that I know I started out, but again, I think at the end of the day, that's what's going to create great product for investors and great strategies.
So you talked for 1 second, you mentioned something around ESG and ratings, and any conversation within BlackRock about these new ESG ratings that are coming out from and I do see you have a question, and I will come to you right away, from Morningstar and more recently MSCI. What do you think about those? How do you think they add to the field or create challenges?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
So the data is challenging, right? The MSCI data, the Sustainalytics data, everyone's doing the best they can with self-reported data. We are constantly having conversations about the importance of investing in research and elevating the quality of the data. We love what SASB's doing. All of those areas we think can are so important and can get better. So on the one hand, we are cautious about reading too much into what the data says. So for example, we often talk about, we're careful not to call them ratings, but investment indicators, right? They have a lot of great information. They tell us a lot. It's not always clear the difference between a single A and a triple B, right? If you go underneath and read the tear sheets. On the other hand, by creating these public ratings, by elevating the profile of ESG in a more quantifiable way, it just means that there's going to be a greater spotlight on the conversation. There's going to be more interest in ESG. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to drive better quality. Companies are going to think, wow, we're getting evaluated on this. We should look at the data. Can it be more precise? Can we do better reporting? Can we give, more metrics? So, I think it's going to take time, and I think there's a circular quality to it. But I think at the end of the day, it is challenging, and it's a great thing.
Okay, thank you. Question. And we'll have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask one. Otherwise, we will close after this question.
Rebecca Jones, Copernic Global. There's obviously a lot of support for this work in BlackRock coming from the top, and a lot of people are on board, but you talked about how you're talking to departments all across the firm, and there are so many people involved. Are you running into pushback in anyone that you're talking to? Are there people who are slower to come on board, and how do you deal with that?
I should say that was probably one of the other surprises that I encountered. The number of colleagues around the firm who raised their hand to get involved in impact. So, everybody that we work with, for the most part, when I started, had another job. And as soon as we start to talk to them about ESG or impact products or ways that they can start thinking about their asset class or their product and how it could be transformed into something that had other dimensions to it, we immediately got uptake, and lots of volunteers, not all millennials, but a lot of millennials. But I think everyone, it just resonates. If you're in this business and the idea that you could actually be creating investment opportunities that had broader outcomes and that could provide other ways of expressing interest of your clients, it's just so appealing and exciting. And I think something that for what we found is in virtually every region, whether it's colleagues who are working with clients, colleagues who are developing products, whether it's our technology group, as we were thinking about how are we going to integrate ESG data, which we did, throughout our risk management platform, so that every single person at BlackRock could log in and get the top 8 metrics that we just used as sort of good indicators. We had a team right away of people who decided we would love to help you figure out how to do that. So, back office, front office, client facing, it didn't matter. There's just been a huge groundswell. And I think it's, an indication, when we were talking about, is this a trend? Is this,
right.
This is, people want to do this with their careers, not just something that it's an investment issue or a consumer issue. I think everybody really, lots of people want to embrace it and find a way to incorporate it every day in what they do.
Ron, you can get our last question.
The last question. I'm Ron Phillips from Maine, and at the local level and grassroots level, there's a lot of work going on in renewable energy and local economies and things that are much below the radar, I guess, of the trillions that you're managing, how you go through that. We just got blocked in Maine from developing the solar industry a little bit more, but we hope to break through that in the future. My question is, it sort of builds a little bit on what came before, that I think ESG is really a great screen. It sounds like you're through that. When your investment groups, and you're managing, I think, what, 4 trillion directly, and then many more trillions indirectly, I guess. When you look at companies that you're investing in and putting in your portfolio, do you have a bucket that says these are non-ESG companies? In other words, they don't have any dimension or aspect to ESG. They're really in the dark side of things, let's say. And then do you ask the question, what risks financially and returns those companies offer to investors, and that you've got to be very careful? I mean, the coal industry is one example of that, let's say. So do you have a non-ESG bucket? Do you screen for non-ESG ineligible?
Right. I would say it slightly differently because
Yeah, okay. Thank
you
you.
know, everybody has ESG, right? I mean, that's the issue. So there aren't any non-ESGs. There are definitely companies that are on the wrong side of ESG. And when I say we engage with 1,500 companies a year, some are the same, some are different. It's all about companies who are on the wrong side of one of those, one of those pillars. And absolutely, from our perspective, it's either a risk or a lost opportunity on the one side. And then on the other side, it's, I would say primarily a risk when we're talking about it from a shareholder value point of view, as I was talking about Michelle's group. And then it's also an opportunity in a lot of ways because for the companies that are getting it right, we think that's a huge boost to long-term shareholder value. So we do look at it on both sides. It's why we push so much for disclosure. I'm on the task force that Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg put together on financial disclosure around climate. And we think that the more of this information that is transparent and available, the more investors globally can evaluate where companies are along that spectrum, because absolutely every single one of those three drive both risk and opportunity.
Well, Deborah, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.